For most of his life, the parents told themselves they were doing what loving parents were supposed to do. They worked longer hours than they should have, skipped vacations, postponed retirement dreams, and quietly adjusted their own expectations so their son could have more. When he struggled through university, they covered the fees without complaint. When he wanted a better apartment closer to the city, they helped with the deposit. When his car broke down, they paid for repairs. When he said he was between opportunities, they transferred money every month and told him not to worry, that families supported each other, that someday he would understand. They never kept a ledger. They never said, "You owe us." They believed love wasn't transactional. They believed if they gave enough, the bond would naturally deepen. And for a long time, the son played his role well. He called regularly, he showed up for holidays, he spoke with gratitude, or at least something that sounded like it. When he met his future spouse, the parents welcomed her, paid for dinners, offered help, tried to include her as family. They ignored the small comments that felt off, the subtle jokes about how old-fashioned they were, the way her parents never reciprocated invitations, the quiet sense that they were being tolerated, not embraced. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It came in stages so small they could be explained away. Phone calls became shorter, plans were canceled last minute, information arrived late or not at all. They would hear about milestones after they'd already happened, a promotion mentioned in passing, a move announced weeks later, a holiday spent elsewhere with no invitation extended. Each time, the parents told themselves not to overthink it. Young couples needed space. Life got busy. They didn't want to be those parents, the ones who hovered, who demanded access, who turned love into obligation. When the engagement happened, they were told through a text message, a photo of a ring, a single line, "We're engaged." No phone call, no shared excitement, no discussion of dates or plans. The parents replied with congratulations, with heart emojis, with offers to help. They asked when they could meet the in-laws properly, when they could talk about arrangements, traditions, anything. The replies were polite but vague. "We'll let you know. Things are still being figured out. We're keeping it small." Weeks passed, then months. Information trickled in through social media rather than conversation. The parents noticed mutual acquaintances congratulating the couple on venues and dates the parents had never heard about. When they asked directly, they were told not to stress, that it was nothing big, that they'd be informed when it mattered. Something about that phrase stuck, when it mattered. To whom? The truth arrived by accident. A cousin mentioned travel plans for the wedding next weekend, assuming the parents were already booked. The room went quiet. The parents smiled politely, then excused themselves, hands shaking as they stepped outside to make a call. Their son didn't answer. They sent a message instead, carefully worded, trying not to sound hurt, trying not to accuse. "We heard the wedding might be soon. We just wanted to check details." The reply came hours later, a paragraph that felt rehearsed. The wedding had already happened. It was very private. Only a few people were invited. The couple wanted to protect their peace. The in-laws were there, close friends were there, but the parents were not. The explanation followed quickly, layered with justification. It wasn't personal. It was about boundaries, about starting their own life, about avoiding negativity. There was a line that landed like a blade wrapped in velvet. "We didn't feel you'd be comfortable there. It's just not really your kind of environment." The parents sat with that sentence long after the phone was set down. Not your kind. They replayed every interaction, every meal paid for, every late-night worry, every sacrifice reframed suddenly as evidence against them. They wondered when love had become something embarrassing, when support had turned into something to hide. They didn't lash out, they didn't demand explanations, they didn't post on social media. They sent a calm message congratulating the couple, saying they were hurt but respected their choices. They asked for time to process. The reply was brief: "We hope you can understand." What followed was silence, not the peaceful kind, the hollow kind. Weeks went by with no calls, no updates, no acknowledgement of birthdays or anniversaries. The parents noticed that when they reached out, responses came slowly and without warmth. Conversations felt transactional, like customer service interactions rather than family. Meanwhile, requests still arrived: help with rent, assistance with a credit card balance, a loan just until the next paycheck. The parents paid at first, out of habit more than agreement. It felt easier than confronting the reality forming in front of them. The breaking point didn't come in a dramatic argument. It came in a casual message asking for a larger sum than usual, followed by the In the months following the cutoff, life for the parents felt quieter than it had in decades. The house was less cluttered, the calendar less crowded. The constant background hum of requests, errands, and crises finally silenced. There was a strange, unfamiliar weight lifted, a tension they hadn't realized had been gnawing at them for years. They spent mornings reading newspapers instead of running errands for someone else, spent evenings cooking meals for themselves instead of assembling trays for relatives who barely acknowledged their presence. They discovered pleasures they'd forgotten, like music at full volume, afternoon naps, walks without a purpose, laughter without expectation. It was not the life of indulgence, not the life they might have once dreamed of, but it was theirs, unclaimed and unpressured. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like living instead of existing for someone else's story. Meanwhile, the son and his spouse faced a reality they had never truly prepared for. Without the steady inflow of financial support, they were forced to make decisions. The apartment that once seemed perfect now stretched every paycheck to the limit. Utilities that had always been paid suddenly became stressors. Car payments, groceries, insurance, all real, unavoidable, and unapologetic. The couple scrambled to balance jobs, expenses, and the image they'd so carefully curated. Social media posts of lavish dinners and weekend getaways gradually dwindled. The filtered perfection faded under the weight of unpaid bills and sleepless nights. And slowly, in private moments, the son began to feel the consequences of choices he had never fully acknowledged before. There were moments of panic when the bank account dipped below zero, frustration when his spouse criticized him for forgetting to pay a bill, moments when he wanted to call his parents, not for money, but for guidance, advice, even just reassurance. Those calls never came because he didn't reach them. The parents remained steadfast in their boundary. No money, no manipulation, no silent guilt. Just the quiet, firm knowledge that actions have consequences and love is not leverage. The couple's attempts to manipulate their parents became more creative, though no less transparent. Texts about feeling abandoned were interspersed with photos of their small victories: dinner cooked, work promotion achieved, apartment cleaned, subtle reminders that the parents had once made these things possible. The spouse began posting images online, tagging mutual friends, trying to paint a picture of struggle and resilience, subtly implying that the parents' withdrawal was harsh, unfair, even cruel. They tried to enlist extended family, sharing selective stories to gain sympathy. But the parents were different now. They didn't react with defensiveness or anger. They didn't send rebuttals or explanations. They observed, quietly, from a distance. And in doing so, they noticed something remarkable. The couple's narrative was unraveling on its own. Mismanagement, overspending, interpersonal tension, and sleepless nights were louder than curated Instagram posts. Subtle cracks formed in the story the couple had built, and no amount of guilt-tripping could fill them. There were moments of temptation for the parents. Occasionally, they would hear a child's voice on the phone, sounding anxious, hopeful, coaxing. A small pang would strike, an old reflex, a parental instinct they couldn't entirely shut off. But each time they reminded themselves why they had set boundaries. They reminded themselves that enabling dependence had never been love. It had been a shield from discomfort. That discomfort was necessary, that the couple needed to face the world they had chosen, just as they had chosen to exclude family from moments that mattered. Through this process, the parents found new ways to engage with the world. They began volunteering at local community centers, offering guidance to younger families, helping neighbors with small acts of support that didn't come with strings attached. They joined book clubs and exercise groups, reconnected with old friends, and pursued hobbies that had been abandoned years ago for the endless cycle of caretaking. They discovered that generosity could be joyful when it wasn't tied to obligation, that support could be given freely without eroding boundaries, that love didn't require being used as a financial crutch. Occasionally, there were updates about the son and his spouse, stories filtered through social media. As the months stretched into a year, the rhythm of life had completely shifted for everyone involved. The son and his spouse had settled into their new reality, and the harsh lessons of independence were no longer abstract. They were inescapable. Gone were the days when a forgotten bill or an empty fridge could be remedied with a simple parental transfer. Now they faced choices they hadn't had to make before: which expenses were essential, which sacrifices could be tolerated, which mistakes had consequences they couldn't ignore. Every decision had weight, and every misstep left them grappling with stress and tension they had never truly understood. Meanwhile, the parents experienced an unexpected clarity. They realized how exhausting it had been to exist as the invisible financial safety net, to constantly mediate conflicts, to cover gaps and smooth over mistakes that were never theirs to fix. Without that role, without the endless burden of responsibility for another's life, they had space, mental space, emotional space to breathe. They found themselves reflecting on years of sacrifice, not with resentment, but with understanding. They had done what they could, and that was enough. That realization brought a peace deeper than any they had known while endlessly giving. During this period, messages from the son became increasingly emotional, increasingly layered with guilt and attempts at persuasion. Sometimes he would reach out in the middle of the night with long texts, recounting struggles at work, financial setbacks, or frustrations in their small apartment. Other times it was subtle: photos of home-cooked meals, carefully staged shots meant to imply, "We're doing okay now," meant to remind the parents of what they had once facilitated. Every message was a test, whether intentional or unconscious, to see if the boundary could be bent. But the parents had learned patience, consistency, and discernment. They replied, yes, but differently than before. They acknowledged feelings, offered advice when asked, celebrated genuine achievements, and expressed love, but never money, never intervention. They were not denying support, they were redefining it. Emotional presence replaced financial crutches, guidance replaced handouts, boundaries replaced enablement. Gradually, cracks began to appear in the son's carefully constructed narrative. The exhaustion of juggling jobs, bills, and expectations created tension between him and his spouse. Arguments that once would have been smoothed over with parental intervention escalated. Stress became a constant background hum. Nights spent worrying about rent and overdue bills became the norm. The reality of adulthood, unbuffered, unmediated, unforgiving, settled heavily over them. For the first time, they understood the difference between dependence and independence. For the first time, the parents were no longer abstract characters in a story. They were absent, silent witnesses to the consequences of choices. The couple tried subtle maneuvers to regain control. They spoke to mutual friends, highlighting their own struggles, seeking sympathy, framing themselves as victims of parental cruelty. They crafted narratives to imply abandonment, to cast the parents as cold, unreasonable, even malicious. But those around them, who had observed the earlier years of support, noticed the contrast. They could see the pattern. Parents who had given decades of aid now standing firm, and children who had chosen exclusion now facing real consequences. The stories began to lose their effectiveness, and the couple's social influence over sympathetic observers weakened. Inside the parents' home, life continued in quiet reclamation. They began cooking meals they enjoyed, reading books they had long postponed, taking walks without schedules, meditating, engaging in creative hobbies, reconnecting with friends they had neglected. The calm they had been denied for so long was no longer just a luxury, it was a lifeline. Their identities shifted subtly. They were no longer defined by their child's dependence or resentment. They were defined by their own choices, their own stability, their own dignity. Even family gatherings became different. Instead of attending every function, worrying about others' comfort, and paying for others' indulgences, they selectively participated in events where respect and mutual regard were evident. They learned to say no politely but firmly. In the end, the parents realized that the chapter with their son was not about punishment or revenge. It was about clarity, boundaries, and self-respect. They had given decades of love, care, and resources, not to control, not to manipulate, but to support. When that support was taken for granted, when exclusion and entitlement replaced gratitude and respect, they chose to step back. The son faced the real world as an adult, fully responsible for his choices, and slowly began to understand the value of what he had once dismissed. He experienced firsthand that independence carries weight and that love without accountability can create dependency rather than growth. For the parents, the withdrawal of support was not cruelty, it was freedom. Freedom from guilt, from exploitation, from endless emotional labor. They learned that true love does not require erasing oneself, that boundaries are not walls but guideposts, and that stepping back sometimes allows others to grow in ways presence cannot force. In time, there were tentative reconnections. Not everything was healed, and some wounds would take years to fade, but the relationship began to shift from one defined by obligation and entitlement to one with the possibility of respect, understanding, and authentic connection. And most importantly, the parents discovered a truth they had long forgotten, that love, when combined with wisdom and courage, is strongest when it honors both the giver and the receiver. They could give without losing themselves. They could care without being used. They could love without sacrificing dignity. And in that balance, they finally found peace. The story ended not in drama or vindication, but in the quiet, powerful clarity of self-respect, a lesson far deeper than any wedding, any financial gift, or any expectation could have taught.